Spittens is my augmented reality game using these interdimensional catworms. So the whole thing started out in January of 2018, at which I had decided to join an AR design class. Now at the time I did not know what augmented reality is or what AR even stood for. I just knew that I would like to try something a bit different. Now at the time, the only thing that I knew that was AR was Pokemon Go. But even then, that's kind of not what the point of AR was. When I joined the class, I found out that apparently Apple had hired 3 colleges, DePaul being one of them, to make an AR game for their iPhone. So the last quarter of the class, they had figured out the general idea of what the game is going to be based around, and which would be interdimensional catworms. Crazy, I know, but it's what the game was going to be around. So with the main concept in place, it was time to figure stuff out. So between me and one other person, we started designing the game that we thought of with these interdimensional catworms. I'm not going to be able to say this right. It's more than one syllable, I swear. But the whole idea was kind of a sandbox kind of deal where there are multiple different catworms going around the floor and stuff you can interact with. Like there's a quartet of catworms that when you tap on them, they'll play a different note or whatnot, kind of like a piano kind of deal. There is a firework one that, like, when you tap on it, it will start shooting up in the sky and explode. But the other thing was that there would be other catworms out there, like the fire one, or a firefighter one, or slash water one, that would interact with each other as well to make it more interesting, because it's their own kind of world. Like I said, it's a sandbox, so you can interact with it, but generally speaking, the worms can also interact with themselves as well. And I had enjoyed this thing a lot as I sketched out a lot of different ideas, like the bookworm, where like have glasses, bow tie, and then when you tapped on him, books would appear from underneath him that would show like settings, options, stuff like that. However, this idea didn't make it into it. What ideas did make it were 3. These 3 ideas were dancing, pulling, and throwing. And I was on the team for pulling. So as part of the pulling team, I was a game designer, as well as with another classmate was another game designer, a programmer, and then I guess kind of a producer in a way, which kept track of what we were doing, how we were doing it, and if we were on task. So the whole idea was very, very simple. It's just pulling the catworms around and taking them to their respective holes. Now, this is a very, very simple game, I must admit, at which we had prototyped very quickly. Except now that we know that it's too simple, as it's not as very fun of just going up to the worm, tapping it, and then just pulling it into the hole. It wasn't very fun. So we had to figure out an idea of how to make it more interesting. So there were two ideas that came up. Number one being able to launch them into the hole. And by launch, I mean taking the catworm, pulling it back so far, and then releasing it, at which it will swing into the hole or something along those lines. Now, to go even further with that idea, we had also thought of creating a sort of Newton's Cradle kind of deal where you would have a line of worms all next to each other, and then you pull the one from one side, and then release it, and it knocks into all the others, and then the one at the end would go into the hole. However, during that whole process of making up new ideas of what we could do with this, our programmer had gone MIA, so to speak, as we had no contact with him. He wasn't responding to anybody, so we were kind of stuck with what we had. So after a while, we had finally gotten a new programmer, but it would be a while until we actually got anything new per se, as the new programmer had to figure out the last guy's programming. So I was tasked, while waiting for this, on making a tutorial kind of deal. So at first, I created a couple of sketches that would be like interactions, so to speak, with the worms, where they're like, "Hey, how's it going? I'm a worm. I'm trying to reach out home. Can you just pull me over there? Cool, thanks." Or things like that. I'd also created a 3D animation that would help show what the player should do in a very translucent kind of deal, kind of ghost-like. So like, you see the worm, and then suddenly a translucent one comes through with a phone and finger. But while also doing that, I also started thinking of other ideas that we try to do besides the pulling back and the Newton's cradle. What else we could do to make the game more fun? So while the new programmer was trying to fiddle with the old programming, I had decided to try coding myself. At which at the time I barely knew anything when it came to the Unity engine, or coding in general for the most part. So a lot of Google was used, I must admit. Although I must admit, I didn't get very far. Because the only other thing that I was able to create was a kind of deal where you would have to swing the worm around in order to collect stuff before it had to go into the hole. But unfortunately, after a while, our programmers backed out as they were busy with other projects. So polling was shut down. Kind of a sad thing, I know. But it's not the only problem. Was the dance theme also got shut down as well, as hardly any progress has made in it also. So the only game mode that really made it out per se was the throwing game, which later became Cosmuse. So there was 2 months roughly until Apple was gonna actually come by once all these events happened. So what ended up happening was I took a venture on my own per se, using the assets that we already had, like the cat worm, the wormholes, and some other stuff that I ended up creating myself. I created a new game mode, which is basically whack-a-mole in augmented reality, at which I had already created a prototype within the first night that we had disbanded everything, which was a very, very simple prototype of just the wormhole would be a block, and then the head box would be just a sphere, so it'd just simulate how the game would play, just like whack-a-mole. At which my teacher was actually impressed that I was actually made a prototype very quickly, and insisted that I'd go further with the project by myself. Initially, the game was going to be like whack-a-mole in a sense, where you'd have a timer, you have so much time to get kind of a scoreboard kind of deal, where you try to get the high score. However, my teacher insisted that I didn't go with this approach towards the game. So, what else do you do with whack-a-mole is the next question. Well, it's very interesting because with how I coded it, it would be a one-shot game. And by one-shot, I mean you'd have to hit them all before they actually make it back into their hole. So the way I coded it was basically taken into an array where it would keep track of all the worms, and then it would tell that worm, hey, pop up. Now, what I ended up doing was making that array go in sequential order to pop them up. Now, this was a very, very bad way of doing it, I guess, maybe not, I don't know. But my coding isn't that great, but I was able to make it come out and do it what I wanted to, eventually. So with the idea of a one-shot, I would lay out the worms in a specific pattern, in which the worms could be coming from the bottom, coming from the side, coming from above on the ceiling. And then the idea would be to make sure you hit the worms before they make it back into the wormhole. If they do make it back into the wormhole, then it's a game over. So it took a lot of time to actually create these levels, as augmented reality is not exactly a very easy thing to create in, as you have to ensure that the player knows what they're doing, because augmented reality is like your whole world. You have to use your camera to look around, and find out what you're doing. So the levels were created in a way to whereas where one ended, the next one would be started. Very easy and simple. But the other thing was I wanted to create this game very specially. By that I mean most AR games are created in this kind of 180-degree area where they only use whatever's in front of the player, nothing around or behind it. What I ended up doing was creating a 360-degree play area where the player would literally go all the way around themselves in order to play this game. So like previously stated, I created each level so that when it ended, the next level would be right there. So the game mode mostly resided of worms just being right around you, pretty much in your face for the most part. And the other thing having to be I had to keep track of is making sure the player didn't get dizzy or anything of that matter. But with all that being said, and with only a week left, I had to finish quickly making UI things, which now are a bit better but not as good. And then finally, Apple showed up. And then Apple left because they weren't impressed at all. Let's just say they didn't go further with what they were going to do with our games. So what ended up coming out of this? Basically a solo created game by yours truly. Though the assets of the 3D models and stuff weren't created by me, I was able to create a game mode that was interesting and still, to this day, I'm still kind of working on, though I must admit I don't have the equipment to work on it anymore. And it was interesting. When I first joined the class, I wasn't sure what game design meant, what to do, and all that. But after actually going through and making this my own, it made me look at it in different ways. Whereas you're fully responsible to make sure that this game plays great, and that it looks awesome, and it sounds right. So the ending being that I was trying to get this onto the App Store. However, the Apple App Store I should be specific about. However, Apple decided that that's not going to happen. So right now it's in limbo. Like I previously stated, I don't have the equipment to further work on it at this time. But it's a nice experience nonetheless.